Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Monk and the Missing Crown. It is a curious detail of history that some of the most remarkable thefts are not those executed with violence, speed, or cunning disguise, but those carried out quietly, in plain sight, over long months of silence. One such case unfolded in the late 19th century within the walls of a monastery in Central Europe. There, among sandstone cloisters and the muted toll of chapel bells, a monk took what was considered untouchable, a crown, a gilded relic that symbolized centuries of devotion and the authority of the church. And for months, perhaps longer, no one even noticed it was gone. The monastery itself had stood for centuries. Its foundations reached back to the medieval age, when kings and noble patrons saw monasteries as both houses of prayer and fortresses of learning. Within its treasury were manuscripts, chalices, and reliquaries. But its most revered possession was the ceremonial crown, not a royal regalia in the conventional sense, but an ornate piece encrusted with semi-precious stones, said to have been gifted by a forgotten noble patron. It was rarely displayed except during feast days or special processions. For the monks who lived and prayed there, it was less an object of wealth than a living thread that tied them to the generations before them. Yet objects that are rarely seen are also rarely checked, and herein lies the peculiarity of the crime. The monk in question, whose name emerges in surviving court records as Brother Matthias, was not remarkable at first glance. He had taken his vows quietly, some said reluctantly. He had come to the monastery in his late 20s after a failed attempt at university study in a nearby city. While other brothers were remembered for their discipline or their devotion, Matthias was remembered for his silences, his tendency to watch more than to speak. Some thought it piety, others indifference. No one, at least at first, suspected calculation. What is known is that Matthias was frequently entrusted with keys. Every monastery had its routines, and he had been given the dull task of overseeing storerooms, linen, and on occasion, access to the treasury where sacred objects were stored. To those around him, it was a matter of convenience. Matthias was methodical, unhurried, and rarely seemed to question his duties. But access, in the end, was everything. The treasury itself was no modern vault. It was a stone chamber with thick wooden doors reinforced by iron bands. Inside, shelves and locked cabinets held the monastery's relics. On a tall pedestal sat a chest, and within that chest, the crown. The locks were sturdy, but they were not made for suspicion within the monastery walls. The presumption was that no monk would steal from God. And so one evening, under the cloak of routine, Matthias lifted the crown from its chest and carried it away. No alarm sounded. No guard stopped him. No other brother even noticed. For weeks, life within the monastery continued unaltered. Chants were sung, candles burned low in their sockets, and bells tolled for mass. Outside, peasants brought grain to the monastery storehouses, and travelers passed through the gates. The absence of the crown was like the absence of a forgotten book on a dusty shelf. But why did he take it? Speculation abounds. Later accounts suggest that Matthias was burdened by debts left from his university days. Others whisper that he had developed connections in town, men who knew how to discreetly sell relics and melt down gilded treasures. Still others suggest something more psychological, a desire to test the silence of his order, to prove that even within holy walls, theft could go unnoticed. Whatever the cause, his theft was not accompanied by drama. It was not noticed, not recorded, not even questioned. For months the crown's absence remained a ghostly secret. Feasts came and went. During one when the crown might have been displayed, the monks simply chose a simpler ornament, claiming the crown was being polished or restored. No one pressed further. Visitors who asked were given vague answers. The silence grew and the absence deepened. In the village nearby, whispers began to circulate. Some claimed the monks had pawned the crown themselves to cover debts. Others believed it had been hidden away for fear of thieves. Yet none of these rumors reached the monastery with enough force to demand inspection. The remarkable feature of this crime is not the theft itself, but the delay. Historians of crime often note that the longer an absence goes unnoticed, the more invisible it becomes. Here was no violent break-in, no dramatic escape. It was the opposite, a crime that depended upon routine, upon trust, upon the quiet assumption that what had always been there was still in its place. And all the while, Matthias lived among the brothers, taking his meals in silence, bowing his head in prayer, tending to the smallest tasks of monastic life. He was no fugitive. He was the very image of stability. Each day that passed without discovery emboldened him further. Some say he even dared to bring the crown into town, piece by piece, separating gems from the structure, trading them quietly for coins. But a question lingers like the echo of a chant in an empty chapel. How could so many eyes fail to notice? How could a monastery, an institution built upon vigilance of the soul, remain blind to so glaring an absence of its most treasured object? It is this question that begins to unravel the silence. For sooner or later, every crown demands to be seen. The silence did not break all at once. In fact, for nearly half a year the crown's absence existed as a kind of unspoken truth, something too delicate, too uncomfortable to be acknowledged outright. It was not until the eve of a great feast day, when preparations required the ceremonial regalia, that questions were finally asked aloud. The sacristan, Brother Johann, was the first to notice. He was a man of meticulous habits, known for counting candles and arranging chalices in perfect order. When he opened the chest expecting to find the crown resting on its velvet cushion, he instead found only emptiness. For a long moment he simply stared, blinking, convinced that perhaps his hands had moved to the wrong chest. But no, the hinges, the iron banding, the marks on the wood were unmistakable. The crown was gone. At first he said nothing. Perhaps it had been taken for polishing, or perhaps the abbot had placed it aside. But when he inquired discreetly, he discovered that no one in authority knew of its removal. The realization passed like a chill draft through stone corridors. The crown, the monastery's most sacred ornament, had vanished, and no one could say when. In a secular household, a theft might have brought shouts, accusations, and swift police inquiry. But monasteries had their own rhythm. At first, the monks debated whether the crown had been misplaced. Cabinets were opened, drawers searched, records checked. For days, no one dared utter the word stolen. To accuse a brother of theft was unthinkable, a rupture of trust so profound that many preferred to believe in some benign confusion. But confusion turned to unease. Whispers traveled during mealtimes, behind folded hands in the cloister garden. How long had it been missing? Who had last seen it? Names began to be murmured, not with outright accusation but with wary speculation. Some recalled that Brother Matthias had been seen more than once in the treasury on errands that seemed vague in purpose. Others noted his frequent trips into town, where he claimed to purchase supplies. The abbot, a man of advanced years with a reputation for calm, was torn. To call in the authorities meant exposing the monastery to scandal. Yet to remain silent risked a greater shame if the theft became public knowledge. After weeks of indecision, he sent a discreet message to the town constabulary, requesting assistance. Thus began one of the most unusual investigations in the region's memory. The local inspector, a practical man named Franz Keller, arrived at the monastery in plain clothes. He walked the cloisters with quiet eyes, listening as much as he questioned. The monks, uneasy in the presence of law enforcement, answered politely but cautiously. Many seemed eager to help, yet unwilling to look directly at one another with suspicion. Keller's first conclusion was simple. The theft could not have been the work of an outsider. There were no signs of forced entry into the treasury, no broken locks, no disturbed doors. The monastery gates had been locked each night, and the brothers accounted for strangers during the day. The crown had been taken by someone with keys, someone within the cloister walls. This deduction cast a long shadow over daily life. Meals became quieter, prayers more strained. Brothers who had once walked together now kept apart. Suspicion is a corrosive thing, and in the monastery's silence it spread swiftly. Brother Matthias, for his part, showed little outward change. He attended his duties with the same quiet composure, bowing his head at the appointed hours, answering questions with neither eagerness nor hesitation. Keller noticed him, of course noted the way he avoided prolonged conversation, the way he offered explanations that were correct yet oddly bloodless, as if rehearsed. But suspicion alone was not proof. Meanwhile, outside the monastery walls, rumors had begun to grow. Word of the missing crown slipped from hushed voices in the sacristy to the ears of villagers at the market. Some claimed the crown had been taken by thieves who bribed a monk. Others whispered that the church itself had sold it to pay hidden debts. A relic gone missing was no ordinary theft. It carried with it the weight of sacrilege, of betrayal against the divine. Keller pressed further. He requested records of monastery expenditures, noting with interest the purchases made in recent months. Some supplies seemed unusually costly. He followed Matthias into town discreetly, observing how he exchanged coins at markets, always in small amounts, always without drawing attention. Yet Keller still lacked the crucial evidence, the crown itself or pieces of it. The tension reached a quiet breaking point during one evening meal. A younger monk, his patience frayed, spoke too sharply. "If the crown is gone, then one among us is a thief." The words hung in the air like smoke. Forks paused mid-motion, eyes flicked toward one another, and silence descended heavier than before. The abbot's rebuke was firm, but the damage had been done. The suspicion was now spoken aloud, no longer a shadow but a palpable weight pressing on every conversation. Behind the monastery walls, the brothers began to watch one another. Some locked their personal chests more carefully, others counted their belongings. Brotherhood had curdled into quiet mistrust. And all the while, Matthias walked among them. Inspector Keller was not blind to the rising tension. He requested permission to search the monks' quarters, a move that the abbot hesitated to approve. To turn over the private cells of men devoted to God was no small act. Yet by then, even the abbot could see that silence had gone too far. He agreed. Keller and his men began the slow, deliberate search. Cells were opened, belongings turned over, books and trunks examined. In most, nothing unusual was found. Rosaries, simple clothing, a scattering of letters. But in Matthias's cell, tucked into a plain wooden box beneath folded garments, something caught the inspector's eye. A velvet pouch, and within it a small gem crudely pried from its setting. It was not yet the crown, but it was enough to darken the suspicions around Matthias into something perilously close to certainty. When Inspector Keller laid the velvet pouch upon the abbot's table, the room fell utterly silent. A single gem, small but unmistakably from the monastery's crown, glimmered in the lamplight. Its edges were rough, as though pried loose in haste. It was proof enough that the crown had not been misplaced, nor hidden for safekeeping, but dismantled, broken apart by human hands. The abbot's face, lined with years of discipline, was grave as he looked at Matthias. The monk did not speak at first. He lowered his eyes, his expression calm, almost detached, as if the accusation belonged to someone else entirely. Yet when Keller pressed him, asked where he had obtained the gem, how it came into his possession, Matthias's composure cracked. He hesitated, shifted in his seat, and then answered with a flatness that surprised everyone present. "It was mine to take. No one cared for it. For months, no one even noticed." The words echoed like a bell struck off key. Keller recorded the confession, though Matthias offered little elaboration. Piece by piece, he admitted, he had removed the crown, pried loose its stones, and exchanged them in town for coins. Some of the gold he had melted down, trading with men who asked no questions. Others he kept hidden, planning to dispose of them gradually. His motive was not a single debt or urgent need, but something harder to define. Resentment, perhaps, or the quiet satisfaction of proving how blind the monastery's trust could be. The shock within the monastery was profound. For generations, the brothers had believed that their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience shielded them from such corruption. To discover that betrayal had come from within from a man who prayed beside them daily was a wound deeper than theft itself. The trial that followed was subdued but closely watched. The town's courthouse was small, its wooden benches filled with curious villagers and a handful of reporters. The charge was simple: theft of property valued far beyond ordinary measure. But the symbolism of the crime gave it weight. To steal a crown from a monastery was not only to rob men, but in the eyes of many to rob God. Matthias sat quietly through the proceedings. He admitted the facts without resistance, neither begging forgiveness nor offering elaborate justifications. Some expected an outburst, a plea, some trace of emotion, but he remained a figure of stillness, his hands folded in his lap, his voice low and even. Witnesses testified. The sacristan described the missing crown. Inspector Keller laid out his evidence. The abbot, dignified even in grief, spoke of trust betrayed. The verdict was inevitable: guilty. Matthias was sentenced to several years in prison, his monastic vows annulled, his name struck from the monastery's records. And so the story might have ended: a crime committed, a thief punished, justice served. Yet the consequences stretched further. The monastery never recovered the crown in its entirety. Fragments were traced to pawnshops and collectors, but much of its gold and many of its stones were lost forever, scattered into the world, melted down into indistinguishable forms. What had once been a single relic of history was now reduced to fragments and memory. For the brothers who remained, the theft forced a reckoning. They had believed their silence was a kind of holiness, a trust beyond question. But silence had also been their weakness, allowing months to pass without action, without vigilance. In the years that followed, the monastery changed its practices. Inventories were kept more rigorously, treasures locked behind stronger doors, responsibilities rotated to prevent any single man from wielding quiet power. The villagers, too, drew their lessons. Some whispered that the monastery's holiness had been tarnished, that if even monks could steal from God, no one was free from corruption. Others argued that the crime was proof of human weakness, a reminder that devotion alone did not extinguish temptation. As for Matthias, little is known of his life after prison. Records suggest he never returned to monastic life. Some say he left the region entirely, seeking anonymity in a distant city. Others claim he drifted in obscurity, a figure remembered not for devotion but for betrayal. His crime was not one of passion or violence, but of patience, silence, and the quiet arrogance of believing no one would notice. The monastery continued, its bells tolling each morning, its cloisters filled with prayer. But for decades afterward, the absence of the crown was felt not just in the empty chest where it once lay, but in the wary glances exchanged between brothers, a lingering reminder that trust, once broken, is never easily restored. And so the question lingers even now in the echo of history. Was Matthias driven by need, by bitterness, or by a darker satisfaction in exposing the blindness of his order? Perhaps all three, perhaps none. What is certain is that a theft can be more than the loss of gold or jewels. It can be the slow unraveling of silence, the breaking of faith, the reminder that even within cloistered walls, human frailty waits quietly in the shadows. Story 2. The Great Post Office Robbery That Nobody Remembered. In the annals of crime, certain robberies linger in memory because of their audacity: armored cars hijacked on highways, trains stopped in the dead of night, safes blasted open with dynamite. Yet not all thefts announce themselves with such drama. Some, perhaps the most remarkable of all, succeed precisely because they leave so little trace. The Great Post Office Robbery, as it came to be quietly labeled in police records, Was one such case a theft that unfolded in such dull regularity that the public barely noticed. And for years afterward, even those most directly affected struggled to recall its details. It began in the late 1920s in a mid-sized European town, the kind of place where cobblestone streets twisted past narrow shopfronts and church spires stood taller than any office building. The post office sat at the center of this world, a squat stone structure with iron bars on the windows and a pair of heavy wooden doors. To the people of the town, it was less a building than a lifeline. Letters from sons overseas, pensions from the government, wages sent home from the city all passed through those doors. The clerks inside wore their authority plainly. They handled not only letters but cash deposits, money orders, and bonds. For some in the village, the post office functioned as a bank more than a service. And like banks, it held sums that to the ordinary eye were staggering. Yet unlike banks, its security was laughably modest. There were no armed guards, no modern vaults, just a handful of clerks, a stout safe, and the assumption that the government seal was protection enough. Enter the thieves. They were not, at least in outward appearance, desperate men or notorious criminals. Records suggest they were postal employees themselves, men who understood the rhythms of delivery, the timetables of trains, the moments when money orders arrived in bulk. One name surfaces most consistently in documents: Carl Reiter, a sorting clerk in his 30s, quiet, punctual, and unremarkable. Yet behind his glasses and tidy uniform, Reiter was observant. He saw where envelopes thick with cash were stored. He noticed when the safe was left open during busy hours. He knew precisely how long it would take for anyone to notice if something went missing. The scheme unfolded not in a single night but slowly, almost invisibly. At first, small sums disappeared, envelopes that might have been misplaced, an order that never quite arrived. The amounts were minor enough to escape real scrutiny, but over time, the thefts grew bolder. Reiter and his accomplices learned that if they staggered their takings, spreading them across weeks, no one could easily track the losses. Audits were irregular, paperwork sloppy, and complaints from senders often drowned in bureaucracy. By some estimates, the theft lasted nearly 2 years. The sums taken, when finally tallied, ran into the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars. Yet astonishingly, no alarm was raised. Ordinary townspeople complained about missing letters, but their voices carried little weight against the inertia of officialdom. The post office remained a place of routine, where clerks shuffled papers and stamped envelopes while money quietly drained away behind the counter. The heist's genius lay in its banality. Nothing dramatic ever happened. No safes were cracked, no windows shattered, no guards overpowered. Instead, the robbery was woven seamlessly into the fabric of daily work. A letter misplaced here, a money order set aside there. Each theft was a drop in the bucket, but over time, the bucket filled to overflowing. When the truth finally emerged, it was not through a daring investigation or a sudden confession. It was through boredom. A mid-level auditor, tired of routine, decided to cross-check a year's worth of records in a single sitting. The discrepancies were too large to ignore. Sums that should have matched the incoming transfers were far short of their totals. Letters registered as delivered had no recipients. Bonds appeared in books but not in storage. By then, the thieves had grown complacent. Some had begun spending more freely in town, their sudden ability to buy new suits or pay off debts attracting whispers. Reiter himself was seen dining in establishments far beyond his clerk's wage. Suspicion, long dormant, began to stir. The investigation that followed would uncover not only theft, but the quiet arrogance of men who believed bureaucracy itself was their ally. Yet at this early stage, when the discrepancies first appeared, the robbery was still hidden behind paperwork and silence. The question lingered in the minds of those who noticed. How long had it truly gone on? And how many letters, how many pensions, how many small savings of ordinary people had vanished into the pockets of men who wore the very uniforms meant to safeguard them? The first sign that something was deeply amiss came not with the discovery of a missing fortune, but with a stack of mismatched numbers. The mid-level auditor, a diligent but otherwise forgotten civil servant named Friedrich Hals, had grown frustrated with the monotony of his work. For years, his job consisted of scanning ledgers, comparing figures, and signing off on totals that almost always balanced. But in the late autumn of 1929, Hals decided to attempt something unusual, a comprehensive check that spanned not just a single quarter but 2 full years of postal transactions. The further he dug, the more the numbers resisted explanation. Deposits that should have matched recorded payouts fell short. Registered mail that should have been accounted for vanished without a trace. Hals, cautious by nature, repeated his calculations again and again, convinced at first that the error was his own. But the gaps only widened. By the time he presented his findings to his superior, the discrepancy had swelled to a sum equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars money that was simply gone. The revelation struck the local postmaster like a thunderclap. For months, perhaps years, money had been disappearing under his very nose. Yet instead of alarm, his first instinct was denial. To admit that such theft had occurred within his own office would be to admit negligence. He ordered Hals to remain silent while he re-verified the accounts. Weeks passed, but the numbers did not change. Eventually, the matter was too large to conceal. Authorities in the regional capital were notified, and the investigation officially began. Inspector Ernst Vogel, a man whose reputation for patience exceeded his fame, was assigned to the case. He was not a detective of the dramatic sort, no trench coat, no pistol theatrics, but a methodical bureaucrat who believed that paper trails never lied. When he arrived in town, the clerks regarded him with suspicion, their eyes dropping to their desks, their answers clipped. Vogel observed them quietly, taking note not only of their words but of the silences between them. His first act was to seize all postal ledgers from the past 5 years. He compared them with railway schedules, delivery routes, and banking records. What emerged was a pattern. The discrepancies aligned almost perfectly with the shifts of certain clerks. One name, again and again, appeared at the heart of these anomalies: Karl Reiter. Reiter, outwardly unshaken, denied everything. He had explanations for each irregularity, couched in the language of bureaucratic confusion: misplaced letters, delays in delivery, clerical oversights. His fellow clerks echoed similar defenses, but Vogel pressed harder, interviewing townsfolk whose pensions had failed to arrive, merchants whose payments had vanished. Their testimonies painted a damning picture. Gradually, accomplices were revealed. 2 other clerks, both younger men who had worked alongside Reiter, admitted under pressure that they had participated in the scheme. They described how envelopes containing cash or bonds were quietly set aside during sorting. The amounts were small enough not to attract immediate suspicion, yet steady enough to enrich them over time. The stolen items were laundered through pawnbrokers and distant relatives, their origins disguised by the tangle of bureaucracy. What astonished Vogel most was not the theft itself, but the length of time it had persisted. For nearly 2 years, ordinary people had complained of missing payments, and their voices had been drowned in official indifference. Letters marked "lost in transit" were filed away, never pursued. The very slowness of the postal bureaucracy, its labyrinth of forms and offices, had become the thieves' greatest shield. The scandal, once exposed, threatened to expand far beyond the town. Newspapers seized upon it, though often with a curious lack of fervor. In an age when headlines were dominated by political turmoil and the global tremors of economic collapse, the quiet siphoning of funds from a provincial post office seemed almost quaint. Reports ran for a few days, then faded. The story lacked bloodshed, drama, or high-profile victims. It was, as one journalist put it dryly, a theft remarkable only for its dullness. Inside the town, however, the mood was less dismissive. For many, the missing funds represented months of labor, pensions that had been withheld, small savings that would never return. Villagers spoke of betrayal not by faceless criminals, but by the very clerks they had greeted daily at the post office counter. The uniforms, once symbols of state authority, now seemed to conceal dishonesty. As the investigation deepened, Vogel faced a question that haunted every step: just how much had truly been stolen? The ledgers offered clues, but the records were riddled with errors and omissions. Some estimates placed the total at $20,000, others nearly double. The figure changed depending on which span of time one counted, or which losses were deemed coincidental. The ambiguity itself became part of the crime's legacy. Reiter and his accomplices, sensing the noose tightening, began to fracture. One clerk confessed more fully, implicating Reiter as the ringleader. He described how Reiter had instructed them to stagger the thefts, to take no more than a few envelopes at a time, and to avoid anything that might immediately trigger alarm. The method was deliberate, a crime that was never supposed to be noticed in the moment, only gradually, after so long a delay that the evidence would be irretrievable. But the evidence, though scattered, was enough. Vogel obtained receipts from pawnbrokers, bank deposits that exceeded clerks' wages, and even a series of letters between accomplices in which the thefts were alluded to obliquely. Piece by piece, the conspiracy was laid bare. Still, one mystery remained unresolved, one that nagged at Vogel even as he prepared his case for trial. Where had the bulk of the money gone? The small sum spent on suits and dinners did not account for the total. Much of it seemed to have vanished as thoroughly as the letters themselves. Had Reiter hidden it, invested it, passed it to shadowy contacts beyond the town? The question lingered like a fog, clouding the investigation's otherwise clear progress. And so, as the trial date approached, the town found itself caught between outrage and indifference. Outrage that trusted clerks had quietly stolen from their neighbors for years. Indifference that, in the larger scheme of things, the crime seemed so very ordinary. Yet beneath that ordinariness lay a troubling truth. If such theft could persist unnoticed here, in a modest provincial post office, how many other small crimes might be unfolding across the country, buried in paperwork, lost in silence? The courthouse was not large, nor was the trial marked by the fanfare of more sensational cases. There were no crowds pressing against the doors, no shouting reporters demanding comment. Instead, the proceedings unfolded with the same slow rhythm as the theft itself, quietly, methodically, without spectacle. At the front sat the judge, his robe more worn than stately, his expression betraying little beyond irritation that such a case had grown so large. Before him stood the accused Karl Reiter, and two of his fellow clerks, their uniforms exchanged for ill-fitting suits. To those who had once queued before them at the post office counter, the sight was jarring. These were not hardened criminals, but the familiar faces of bureaucratic routine. The man who weighed parcels, the one who stamped envelopes, the one who handed over wages with a bored glance. The charges were laid out plainly: systematic theft of postal funds over a period of nearly 2 years, conspiracy to defraud the state, and abuse of public trust. The prosecution presented ledgers, testimony from pawnbrokers, and confessions from the accomplices. Piece by piece, the dull mechanics of the crime were reconstructed. Reiter listened impassively. When asked directly whether he had orchestrated the thefts, he denied it. His defense rested on ambiguity: errors in bookkeeping, misplaced parcels, the unreliability of witnesses. For a time, his lawyers argued that the discrepancies were too broad to attribute to a handful of clerks, that the missing funds were evidence of systemic inefficiency rather than individual malice. But Vogel's investigation had been thorough. The trail of small purchases, the correspondence between clerks, the recovered envelopes all pointed back to Reiter. The verdict was never in doubt. Reiter was sentenced to several years in prison, his accomplices receiving lighter terms in recognition of their cooperation. The sums stolen were never fully recovered. Some bonds were traced and restored to their rightful owners, but much of the money had vanished, dissolved into expenses, hidden caches, or investments so obscure they left no trail. For the townspeople, the conclusion was both vindicating and disappointing. Justice had been served, yet the damage was not undone. Pensioners who had lost their payments were never fully compensated. Small merchants absorbed their losses in silence. The government issued statements of regret but little more. In time, life in the post office resumed its routines. New clerks filled the vacancies, counters reopened, and letters continued to flow. What is most striking in hindsight is how quickly the memory of the crime faded. Newspapers, already preoccupied with the tremors of economic collapse and political upheaval, devoted only a few columns to the sentencing. The theft, remarkable in its persistence, was quietly shelved as a minor embarrassment. Within a few years, it was little more than a footnote in dusty archives. Yet for those who lived through it, the robbery left subtle scars. Trust in the postal clerks never fully recovered. People hesitated when handing over money orders, watched more carefully when pensions were distributed. A simple act stepping up to the counter of a government office had been revealed as vulnerable, even treacherous. Inspector Vogel, reflecting later in his reports, described the case as a crime of routine. It was not committed with violence, nor with genius, but with patience, the slow drip of theft against the background of silence. In its very dullness lay its danger, for it thrived on inattention. Historians of crime would later stumble across the records and note how little it had entered public memory. Unlike train robberies or bank heists, it lacked glamour. No one wrote ballads about stolen envelopes. But in another sense, it was more troubling than all of those. A reminder that theft need not be loud to be devastating, that trust can be eroded not by a single act of betrayal, but by countless tiny ones, repeated until they hollow out the institution itself. And so the great post office robbery passed into obscurity. The men who committed it served their time and disappeared from view. The town rebuilt its routines. The state filed the case away. But somewhere, perhaps even now, in old attics or forgotten lockboxes, there may remain traces of the theft, a pawn ticket, a hidden envelope, a loose bond that once belonged to a pensioner who never saw his payment. The legacy of the robbery is not in its sums or its sentences, but in its lesson, that the most extraordinary crimes are sometimes the most ordinary, unfolding not with a bang but with a whisper, leaving behind not shock but silence. Story 3. The librarian who sold first editions on the side. In every town, there are buildings that seem immune to scandal. Churches, schools, libraries, places woven so deeply into the fabric of daily life that wrongdoing inside their walls feels almost unthinkable. That was the atmosphere in which one of the strangest crimes of the 20th century unfolded. A theft not of money or jewels, but of books. Not just any books, but rare first editions, carefully cataloged, cherished by scholars, and entrusted to the care of one man. The crime was discovered only by accident. For nearly a decade, volumes had been vanishing from the municipal library of a mid-sized European city. These were not the circulating copies borrowed by students and readers. They were treasures kept in the special collection, a locked room set apart from the general stacks, where first editions, incunabula, and manuscripts rested behind glass cases. Few patrons ever saw them, but their presence gave the library prestige, a reputation for housing more than just novels and newspapers. The librarian in charge of these volumes was a man named Otto Haas. In public memory, he was remembered as quiet, courteous, and unremarkable. He had begun his career shelving books as a student worker, later earning a permanent position thanks to his encyclopedic memory for titles and authors. Over the years, he became the natural custodian of the rare books collection. He alone kept the keys. He alone updated the catalogs. For a long time, no one questioned this arrangement. Haas was devoted, punctual, and seemingly incorruptible. He lived in a modest flat, walked to work each morning, and spent his evenings alone, often seen carrying stacks of journals to and from his apartment. To the casual observer, he was the very image of a man consumed by his profession. But behind that mask of diligence, a quiet betrayal was taking shape. The scheme began small. A single volume, a slim 18th century poetry collection, disappeared from the catalog. Haas signed it out under the pretext of restoration, a vague category rarely audited. In truth, he carried it out under his coat and sold it to a discreet book dealer in another city. The money he received was modest compared to the book's true value, but it was more than Haas's monthly wage. From there, the thefts multiplied. A philosophical treatise here, a rare atlas there. Haas was careful never to remove too many at once, and he maintained meticulous records to conceal the losses. Books listed as in restoration remained so indefinitely. Others were noted as loaned to institutions that, when contacted, had no record of such arrangements. To an untrained eye, the catalog appeared consistent. Only Haas knew which entries concealed gaps. For years, the thefts went unnoticed. Libraries are not banks, and their inventories are rarely checked with rigor. Administrators trusted Haas implicitly, his long service earning him a reputation for reliability. Meanwhile, collectors and dealers in other cities were quietly delighted by the sudden appearance of rare volumes at surprisingly reasonable prices. Few asked questions. In the world of rare books, provenance is often a matter of trust, and Haas exploited that trust with precision. The turning point came not through suspicion, but through coincidence. A visiting scholar from another country requested access to a particular edition of Goethe's Faust, one of the jewels of the collection. Haas, caught off guard, informed him that the volume was currently under restoration. The scholar, disappointed, mentioned casually that he had seen the very same edition listed in a dealer's catalog just weeks before. The detail slipped into the conversation almost as an afterthought, but it planted a seed of doubt. Later, the scholar mentioned it to another librarian, who, though hesitant to challenge Haas, decided to check. When she could not locate several other volumes listed as under restoration, her unease deepened. A quiet inquiry was made to the library's governing board. Thus began the unraveling of a theft that had persisted for nearly a decade. The first questions were discreet: a request for Haas to produce records of restoration contracts, receipts, or correspondence. He stalled, offering vague explanations. He spoke of delays, of specialized binders, of misplaced paperwork. But librarianship is a profession of precision, and excuses that might pass elsewhere sounded hollow in the echo of empty shelves. When auditors finally descended on the library, the scale of the loss became clear. Dozens of volumes were missing, some centuries old, others among the first printings of major works. The catalog, once thought to be meticulous, was riddled with false entries. What had begun as isolated suspicion now revealed itself as a systematic plundering. The question was no longer whether Haas had stolen, but how long and how much, and most hauntingly of all, how many of the lost treasures could never be recovered. The first thing investigators discovered, once Haas's scheme began to unravel, was that the theft was never truly hidden. It had been dispersed. The missing books had not vanished into obscurity, nor been destroyed. They had been quietly sold, cataloged, and in some cases even proudly displayed by collectors who had no idea of their illicit origin. The scholar's chance remark about Goethe's Faust had drawn attention, and within weeks the library's administrators contacted the local authorities. The case was passed to Inspector Wilhelm Drexler, a man who, like the earlier Inspector Vogel in the post office case, had built his reputation not on theatrics but on patience. Drexler believed that every crime left a paper trail, and in the world of books, the trail was literal. His first step was to interview Haas directly. Sitting across from the librarian in his modest office, Drexler found himself confronted with a man who exuded calm authority. Haas denied wrongdoing with quiet conviction, insisting that the missing volumes were either out for binding or temporarily loaned to institutions abroad. He produced a stack of handwritten notes, vague references to workshops in Vienna or Leipzig. Yet when Drexler attempted to verify these claims, he found nothing but silence. No restorers had received such volumes, No institutions had borrowed them. The inspector's next move was to contact rare book dealers across the region. At first, many were evasive. Dealers live in a world of discretion, where clients value anonymity and questions are seldom asked too closely. But under pressure, several admitted to having purchased books from a man who matched Haas's description. The deals were modest at first, a single volume here, another there, but over the years they grew more regular. Haas had cultivated a reputation among dealers as a quiet supplier with access to unusual material. The pattern became clear. Haas would remove books one at a time, never enough to draw sudden suspicion. He would travel to a neighboring city on his days off, carrying the volume wrapped in paper, and sell it to a dealer for cash. The dealers, delighted by the steady supply of treasures, asked few questions. In some cases, Haas even used false names, signing receipts as Herr Winter or Herr Brandt. As Drexler dug deeper, he discovered that Haas had not spent his illicit earnings lavishly. Unlike Reiter, the postal clerk who flaunted his gains on suits and dinners, Haas lived with continued modesty. His flat remained sparsely furnished, his clothing plain. The money, it turned out, had gone largely into savings accounts under false identities, carefully tucked away for the future. His crime was not born of desperation, but of slow, calculated greed. The investigators soon realized the scale of the loss was greater than anyone had feared. Over 100 volumes were unaccounted for, some dating back to the 16th century. A few were traced to collectors in Switzerland, others as far away as England. Each discovery raised new complications. Could the books be reclaimed, or had they become, in the eyes of the law, the property of their new owners? Meanwhile, whispers spread through the library staff. Colleagues who had long admired Haas were stunned. Some defended him still, insisting there must be some mistake. Others confessed that, in retrospect, they had found his solitary habits troubling, the way he locked himself in the rare books room for hours, the way he discouraged others from assisting with cataloging. Yet none had spoken up at the time. Silence, once again, had been the thief's greatest ally. For Drexler, the most difficult part of the case was not proving that Haas had stolen the books, but proving intent. Haas remained calm under questioning, never confessing outright. He insisted that the records were merely out of order, that dealers had misidentified volumes, that the books would eventually be found. His tone was not defiant but weary, as though he considered the whole affair a tiresome misunderstanding. But the evidence mounted. Receipts signed in false names, handwriting samples that matched Haas's notes, testimony from dealers who recognized him, a small cache of volumes discovered hidden in his apartment, not displayed, but wrapped in paper and stacked in a corner, awaiting disposal. The double life of Otto Haas had been laid bare. By day, he was the devoted custodian of culture, a man trusted with irreplaceable works of history. By night, or rather, in quiet trips out of town, he was a trafficker in those very treasures, selling them piece by piece to feed a private fortune. The shock among scholars was profound. Libraries, long seen as temples of knowledge, were suddenly revealed as vulnerable. If a trusted librarian could plunder a collection for nearly a decade without detection, what other treasures might already have been lost from other institutions, unnoticed and unrecorded? By the time Haas was formally charged, the case had grown into something larger than the theft of books. It had become a question of institutional trust, of how a single man had exploited the silence of a system designed to guard memory itself. And yet, even as the case moved toward trial, one haunting question remained. How many of the stolen books could ever be recovered, and how many had slipped permanently into the shadows of private collections, lost to the public forever? When the case finally came to court, it did not draw the crowds of sensational murder trials or political scandals. There were no mobs clamoring at the doors, no international reporters jostling for space. Instead, in the high-ceilinged municipal courtroom, a modest audience of scholars, journalists, and curious townspeople gathered to watch the fall of a man who had once been the quiet guardian of their city's knowledge. Otto Haas sat at the defendant's table, his posture straight, his spectacles perched neatly on his nose. To the casual eye, he looked less like a criminal than like the librarian he had always been, a man who might have scolded a reader for returning a book late. Yet the charges laid out before him were anything but mundane: theft of cultural property, falsification of records, and fraudulent sale of state-owned artifacts. The prosecution built its case carefully. Dealers testified, reluctantly at first but with mounting clarity. They described the man who had visited their shops carrying rare volumes wrapped in brown paper, always alone, always discreet. Some recalled that he had used false names but the same steady voice. Others admitted that they had suspected something was amiss, but the prices were fair, the books authentic, and the temptation too strong to resist. Next came the evidence: receipts, catalogs, and most damning of all, the books themselves. Several volumes were displayed in court, their spines worn but their provenance undeniable. In the margins of one, a faint library stamp bore witness to its origin. In another, a catalog number, carefully erased, was still faintly visible. Haas listened with impassive calm. When asked directly whether he had stolen the books, he denied it. He claimed that the records were incomplete, that he had acted under instructions to loan the volumes, that the missing books would eventually be found. But his words rang hollow against the weight of evidence. The defense argued that Haas was a scapegoat, that the missing books reflected systemic negligence rather than deliberate theft. They painted him as a diligent man overwhelmed by bureaucratic chaos, not a criminal mastermind. But the image faltered when confronted with the hidden volumes discovered in his apartment, the receipts signed with false names, the bank accounts containing deposits far beyond a librarian's modest salary. For scholars who attended the trial, the betrayal cut deeper than money. Books are not mere objects. They are vessels of history, fragile threads connecting past and present. To see them treated as commodities, traded for cash in backroom deals, was to witness a desecration of trust. The verdict, when it came, was unsurprising. Haas was found guilty on all counts. His sentence was years of imprisonment, along with the loss of his position, his pension, and the professional reputation he had spent a lifetime cultivating. The judgment was severe but not sensational, a quiet ending for a quiet crime. Yet the story did not end with the gavel's fall. The fate of the stolen books remained unsettled. Some were returned to the library after long negotiations with dealers and collectors. Others were never recovered, having disappeared into private collections across Europe, their origins erased or conveniently forgotten. Even today, scholars suspect that certain rare volumes on the shelves of distant estates or auction houses may once have rested in the locked cabinets of Haas's library. For the library itself, the scandal prompted sweeping reforms. No longer would a single man hold the keys to the special collection. Inventories were updated regularly, outside auditors appointed, catalogs cross-checked. The lesson was bitter but necessary. Trust must be tempered with vigilance. As for Haas, little is known of his life after prison. Some say he returned to obscurity in another city, living under a different name. Others suggest he faded into poverty, his savings confiscated, his future erased. The man who once presided quietly over rows of priceless books became, in the end, a cautionary tale. And yet the memory of his theft raises enduring questions. Why did he do it? Was it greed, or the thrill of outwitting a system built on trust? Was it resentment at a life of obscurity, a desire to leave some mark, however destructive, on the world? Perhaps the most unsettling question of all is not why Haas stole, but how long he succeeded before anyone noticed. For nearly a decade, volumes vanished into silence, and no one asked the right questions. It was not the brilliance of the thief that sustained the crime, but the complacency of those who trusted him. The story of Otto Haas reminds us that crimes need not be violent or spectacular to wound deeply. Sometimes the gravest betrayals occur in quiet rooms, under fluorescent lights, in the turning of a catalog page where a book should be and is. Story 4. The town where the bank kept getting robbed by its own clerk. Banks, perhaps more than any other institutions, live and die on the perception of trust. To deposit one's wages, one's savings, one's future in the hands of another requires faith not only in security systems and locks, but in the very people behind the counter. In one small European town in the early 20th century, that trust was betrayed not once, but over and over by the very man whose job it was to guard it. The story begins in a rural district, where the town's single bank stood on the corner of the central square. It was not a grand institution with marble columns or vast vaults. Rather, it was a modest branch of a regional bank, a squat brick building with wooden counters and a staff of only 4 clerks. Most of the town's farmers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen kept their money there, treating the clerks less as bankers and more as neighbors. Among those clerks was a man named Emil Kraus. He was, at first glance, the picture of reliability. In his mid-40s, balding, bespectacled, and unfailingly polite, Kraus had worked at the bank for over 15 years. He knew every customer by name, inquired after their children, and offered advice on savings accounts with a tone of quiet authority. To many, he was not just a clerk but a trusted confidant. And yet, over the span of several years, the bank suffered a series of puzzling losses. Small amounts of money seemed to vanish from ledgers. Balances recorded in customers' passbooks did not quite match the bank's accounts. At first, these discrepancies were written off as clerical errors. The bank, after all, still operated largely on handwritten ledgers, and mistakes were not uncommon. A misplaced decimal, an entry skipped on a busy day, such things happened. But as the months stretched into years, the losses grew harder to ignore. Entire deposits appeared to vanish. Withdrawals were recorded that customers swore they had never made. When complaints arose, Kraus himself was often the one who soothed them, explaining with practiced calm that the error would be corrected, the missing funds located, the account adjusted. More often than not, customers believed him. His authority and long-standing service gave weight to his words. What no one realized, not the customers, not even the bank's manager, was that Kraus himself was the thief. His method was deceptively simple. He would record deposits in customers' passbooks but omit them from the official ledgers, pocketing the cash. Or he would alter withdrawal slips, inflating the amounts and taking the difference. When small errors surfaced, he would cover them with adjustments in other accounts, a shifting of figures that balanced the books just enough to avoid scrutiny. The genius of his scheme lay in its ordinariness. The amounts were never dramatic, a few marks here, a handful of guilders there, large enough to matter over time but small enough to be dismissed as mistakes. Customers trusted him too much to question him harshly, and his fellow clerks assumed his long tenure was proof of integrity. For years, the theft continued. Kraus lived modestly, never flaunting his gains. He did not purchase new suits or throw lavish parties. Instead, he funneled the money into quiet investments, property bought under relatives' names, savings accounts opened in distant towns. To the outside world, he appeared the same humble bank clerk he had always been. The first crack in the facade came when a farmer, meticulous by nature, insisted on reconciling every entry in his passbook with the bank's records. When the discrepancies could no longer be explained away as error, suspicion began to grow. The farmer pressed harder, eventually writing directly to the regional headquarters. An audit was ordered. For the first time in years, outsiders scrutinized the ledgers with fresh eyes. The deeper they looked, the more they found. Numbers did not add up. Balances contradicted themselves. Transactions bore handwriting that was suspiciously uniform Kraus's handwriting. At first, the other clerks were stunned. They had worked beside Kraus for years, shared meals, even trusted him with their own accounts. That he could have been orchestrating the theft all along seemed unthinkable. Yet the evidence mounted, page by page, ledger by ledger. Kraus, confronted at last, did not confess immediately. He claimed the errors were misunderstandings, the result of sloppy bookkeeping. But when investigators uncovered property deeds and savings accounts in distant towns, the truth became undeniable. The quiet, dependable clerk had siphoned away thousands from the very neighbors who trusted him most. The shock to the town was profound. How could a man so ordinary, so familiar, have betrayed them all? How many of their savings had vanished into his careful pockets? And how long had he believed he could continue without being caught? The answers would come in time, through investigation, trial, and the slow unraveling of a life built on deception. But in those first days, as whispers spread through the market square and neighbors glanced suspiciously at one another, one question lingered louder than all the rest. If even a man like Emil Kraus could not be trusted, who could? When the regional auditors arrived at the bank, they brought with them not only ledgers and ink but a sharp air of suspicion that cut through the small-town atmosphere like a cold wind. For years, the bank's books had been trusted implicitly. Customers saw their balances written neatly into their passbooks, and that was enough. Few ever questioned the ledgers kept in the back office. But now, each line, each number, each entry in the thick, leather-bound volumes was scrutinized with a care that unsettled the clerks. At first, the auditors found what they expected: small mistakes, transposed numbers, the sort of clerical errors that occurred in any institution still reliant on ink and quill. But as they dug deeper, a pattern emerged. The mistakes seemed to follow a rhythm, repeating in ways too deliberate to be accidental. Deposits made in cash would appear in customers' passbooks, yet were absent from the central records. Withdrawal slips showed amounts that had been altered, sometimes by a single digit, but always in ways that favored the bank's coffers, or more precisely, the clerk responsible for recording them. Time and again, the trail led back to one man's handwriting, Emil Kraus. The auditors marked page after page with notes, building a picture of a scheme that had unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, across years. It was theft conducted not with dynamite or pistol, but with ink and quiet confidence. What astonished them most was not only the scale of the theft, which they estimated in the thousands, but the fact that it had persisted for so long without discovery. The bank's manager, Herr Mueller, was devastated. A man of stern habits and old-fashioned values, Mueller had trusted Kraus more than any other employee. He had relied on him to train younger clerks, to reconcile accounts, even to handle his own savings. Now, faced with the evidence, he felt not only the bank's security but his own judgment had been betrayed. The townspeople, too, were stunned. Whispers spread quickly in the marketplace and taverns. Everyone knew Kraus. He had grown up in the town, attended local schools, greeted neighbors on his morning walks. He was the man who had once collected coins for church repairs, who had been seen carrying groceries for elderly customers. That such a man could have systematically stolen from them for years was a blow not only to their savings, but to their sense of community. Inspector Heinrich Bauer, a methodical investigator from the regional police, was assigned to oversee the case. He began by interviewing customers whose accounts had been affected. A farmer described how his deposit for seed money never appeared in the bank's records, though Kraus had personally entered it into his passbook. A shopkeeper told of a withdrawal that showed more money taken than he had requested. In each case, the link pointed back to Kraus. When questioned directly, Kraus remained calm. He denied intentional wrongdoing, suggesting that the bank's systems were outdated, its records poorly maintained. He reminded investigators of his 15 years of service, his loyalty, his reputation. For a time, some even wondered whether he might be right, whether the discrepancies were merely the inevitable result of sloppy bookkeeping. But Bauer pressed harder. He followed the money beyond the bank's walls. In nearby towns, property deeds revealed purchases made under Kraus's relatives' names. Savings accounts appeared with deposits that matched the sums missing from the ledgers. These were not the signs of error, but of deliberate design. The more evidence piled up, the clearer the picture became. Kraus had orchestrated a slow, patient embezzlement that siphoned money from dozens of townspeople into his own pocket. He had relied on trust, on routine, on the quiet assumption that no one would ever question a clerk who had served faithfully for so many years. And yet, even as the case against him solidified, another mystery loomed. Just how much had he taken? The auditor's estimates varied. Some believed the total was modest, perhaps a few thousand marks. Others, tracing the discrepancies across years, suggested the sum could be far larger. The longer they looked, the more the losses seemed to spread, like cracks in an old wall. As the audit deepened, so too did the divisions in the town. Some defended Kraus, insisting there must be another explanation, that Emil could not have betrayed them. Others, especially those who had lost savings, demanded swift justice. In the square, arguments broke out between neighbors. Old friendships were strained. The theft had not only emptied pockets but poisoned trust itself. By the time Kraus was formally charged, the town was no longer asking whether he had stolen, but how he had managed to keep it hidden for so long, and more uneasily, whether he had acted alone. Some whispered that others in the bank must have known, or at least looked the other way. Could one clerk truly have fooled everyone for years? The trial promised to answer those questions. But for now, the image of the quiet, bespectacled clerk sitting at his desk, calmly writing numbers into ledgers while siphoning away the town's savings, haunted every account holder who had ever trusted him. And one question lingered in Inspector Bauer's mind as he prepared his case. If Kraus had been so careful for so long, what had finally pushed him into carelessness, allowing his scheme to unravel? The trial of Emil Kraus was not a grand affair. There were no national reporters, no breathless headlines in distant cities. To outsiders, it was the story of a single bank clerk caught stealing in a provincial town, a petty scandal at best. But to the people who filled the courthouse benches, it was nothing less than a betrayal of their lives. On the opening day, farmers arrived in their Sunday coats, shopkeepers closed their shutters early, and townspeople crowded into the narrow aisles. They came not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a need to understand how a man they had trusted for decades could have stolen from them with such ease. Kraus sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his round spectacles perched on his nose, his face pale but composed. He did not look like a criminal. He looked, as he always had, like a clerk, a man more comfortable with ink than with speech. His defense lawyer, a weary local advocate, argued that the losses were the result of outdated bookkeeping, errors in recording, and systemic negligence. "My client is not a thief," he insisted. "He is a scapegoat for a broken system." But the prosecution had little trouble dismantling that claim. One by one, witnesses took the stand. The farmer who had deposited his seed money only to find it missing. The widow whose pension never reached her account. The shopkeeper who noticed withdrawals larger than he had requested. Each story was personal, vivid, impossible to dismiss. Then came the auditors. With ledgers in hand, they demonstrated the pattern. Deposits omitted from official books, withdrawals altered, balances shifted between accounts to cover gaps. The handwriting was Kraus's. The timing matched his shifts. And most damning of all, property deeds and savings accounts in nearby towns bore his signature, funded by money that could only have come from the bank. When confronted with this evidence, Kraus did not rage or protest. He simply denied. He claimed that others had access to the ledgers, that the handwriting could have been forged, that the deeds were investments made by relatives. His voice remained calm, steady, even persuasive at times. But in the quiet of the courtroom, his denials sounded less like truth and more like habit, the practiced evasions of a man who had lied successfully for years. The verdict was never in doubt. After weeks of testimony, the judge pronounced Kraus guilty of embezzlement and fraud. His sentence was years in prison, his assets seized, his name disgraced. For the townspeople, it was justice, but not satisfaction. Many would never recover their stolen savings. The money was gone, scattered into investments and hidden accounts that the authorities could only partially reclaim. The bank itself survived, but just barely. Regional managers rushed to reassure customers, implementing stricter audits, new bookkeeping systems, and fresh clerks brought in from other towns. Yet the damage lingered. For years afterward, customers hesitated before handing over their deposits, glancing at the clerks behind the counter with suspicion. Trust, once broken, did not return easily. As for Kraus, he faded quickly into obscurity after serving his sentence. Some said he was released quietly and moved to another region under an assumed name. Others believed he lived out his final years in poverty, abandoned by family and friends alike. The exact details are uncertain. What is certain is that his name became a byword in the town not just for theft, but for betrayal. And in the years that followed, the story of the bank clerk who robbed his own town was told in hushed tones, not as an exciting tale of daring, but as a cautionary reminder of how ordinary trust can be eroded one careful entry at a time. It left behind a troubling reflection, one that stretched beyond the little town's borders. If a man like Emil Kraus, quiet, diligent, ordinary, could patiently siphon away the lifeblood of a community without anyone noticing for years, how many other trusted figures, in banks or schools or churches, might be doing the same, hidden in plain sight? Story 5. The long silence of the poison pen letters. In the study of crime, most cases turn on tangible things: stolen money, missing jewels, vanished objects. But some of the most corrosive crimes leave no broken safes or smashed locks, only words on paper. In one small English village in the mid-20th century, an anonymous hand turned gossip into a weapon. Over a span of years, letters filled with venomous accusations appeared in mailboxes, sowing suspicion, ruining reputations, and tearing apart the fragile web of community trust. The culprit was not a murderer or a thief in the conventional sense, but a poison pen, an unseen correspondent whose words were as destructive as any blade. The story begins in the village of Little Ashford, a farming community of a few hundred people, where everyone knew everyone else's name. Life revolved around the rhythm of church bells, market days, and small-town routines. Disputes existed, of course, a quarrel over a fence line, a whispered rumor about a shopkeeper's daughter, but for the most part, people lived side by side in a kind of quiet interdependence. That quiet ended the day the first letter arrived. It was a thin envelope, addressed in blocky handwriting to a local farmer. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in crude accusations. The farmer was accused of cheating his neighbors, of mistreating his wife, of sins he swore he had never committed. The letter ended with a warning: "Everyone knows the truth about you now." The farmer dismissed it as the work of a crank, but within weeks, other villagers received similar letters. A schoolteacher was accused of theft. A shopkeeper was branded an adulterer. A young woman was called promiscuous in terms too cruel to repeat. Each letter was anonymous, each written in the same jagged hand, each dripping with malice. At first, villagers tried to ignore them, but the letters kept coming. Dozens, then hundreds, spread over months. No one was spared, not the wealthy, not the poor, not even the vicar. Each envelope carried not only slander but fear. For if the accusations were false, why did they seem so plausible? If they were true, who had revealed them? The community began to fracture. Friends eyed one another with suspicion. Old quarrels resurfaced, now fueled by anonymous confirmation. Husbands and wives quarreled over hidden doubts. Neighbors who had spoken daily now crossed the street to avoid one another. The local constabulary grew involved after the letters began to threaten violence. Investigators collected samples, compared handwriting, and searched for clues. But the poison pen was clever. Letters were mailed from different towns, sometimes even slipped under doors by hand. The writing style shifted subtly, as if the author was deliberately disguising their hand. Whispers spread through Little Ashford like smoke. Some were sure the culprit was a bitter spinster with too much time. Others suspected a jealous husband, a dismissed servant, even the postman himself. Every villager, it seemed, had both motive and opportunity in someone's eyes. And all the while, the letters continued. The most chilling aspect of the case was not the words themselves, but the silence they created. Accusations went unchallenged, friendships dissolved without confrontation. It was easier to withdraw than to argue, safer to suspect than to trust. The poison pen had no need of a knife or gun. Their weapon was doubt, and in the silence it bred, the community began to eat itself alive. Years later, criminologists would study the case as an example of how anonymity could destabilize entire communities. But at the time, for the people of Little Ashford, the question was simpler and far more urgent. Who among them was the unseen hand behind the poison pen letters? The arrival of each new letter was like the tolling of a bell no one could silence. At first, villagers collected them quietly, tucking them into drawers, hoping the storm would pass. But as the months wore on and the accusations multiplied, the atmosphere of the village shifted. Suspicion became the dominant language. Every glance seemed weighted, every word parsed for hidden meaning. The poison pen had succeeded in turning a community into a circle of wary eyes. The police did what they could. Dozens of letters were gathered, spread across tables in the constabulary office like specimens in a grim collection. Each bore the same blocky handwriting, awkward capitals, uneven spacing, letters pressed too hard into the page. Experts examined them, hoping to match the hand to someone in the village. But the culprit was careful. Some letters were disguised in a looser scrawl, others written with left-handed awkwardness, as if the writer enjoyed playing with the investigator's certainty. Fingerprints yielded nothing. Postmarks led only to confusion. Sometimes the letters were mailed from nearby towns, other times they appeared in local boxes without any postage at all. Whoever was responsible knew how to sow chaos as effectively as they sowed words. Inevitably, villagers began to accuse one another. A widow who lived alone was whispered to be the author. She was bitter, they said, lonely, envious of others. A young farmhand was named. He had been rejected by a local girl. Perhaps this was his revenge. Even the vicar's wife was not spared suspicion. Her neat handwriting resembled, in some eyes, the tidy letters of the poison pen. The investigations were as much social as criminal. Constables interviewed villagers, their questions turning up old grievances. "Who do you think would want to harm you?" they asked. The answers painted a map of rivalries and jealousies long buried. Disputes over land, over money, over love affairs whispered in the dark. Suddenly, everyone had motive. One name surfaced again and again: Mrs. Edith Lawson, a middle-aged woman who had lived in the village her entire life. She was known for her sharp tongue and her habit of gossip. Neighbors recalled how she often commented on other people's affairs with unsettling accuracy. Her handwriting, when obtained, bore some resemblance to the jagged script of the letters. The police brought her in for questioning. Edith denied everything indignantly. "I have my faults," she told the inspector, "but I do not write lies and filth in the night." Yet the suspicion stuck. When new letters arrived even while she was under questioning, some villagers believed it only proved her cunning. Others pointed out it might mean she was innocent after all. Meanwhile, the poison pen grew bolder. The letters became more vicious, targeting not just individuals but families. They accused fathers of abusing daughters, mothers of infidelity, sons of theft. Each accusation planted a seed of doubt, and in the fertile soil of fear, those seeds grew into silence. Marriages began to falter. A shopkeeper's wife left him after a letter accused him of keeping another woman. A schoolteacher resigned, unable to bear the whispers that followed an accusation of theft. The village, once bound by shared routines, now seemed to fracture into isolated households, each wary of the other. Inspector Harold Briggs, brought in from the county seat to aid the investigation, described the atmosphere as a prison without walls. He noted that the letters had achieved something remarkable. They required no violence, no physical force. The fear of exposure, whether true or false, was enough to control the village. Briggs focused his inquiry not only on the content of the letters but on their timing. He noticed that many arrived just before village events, market days, church services, the annual harvest fair. It was as though the poison pen wanted to ensure that whispers would be fresh when neighbors met face to face. The letters were not random acts of cruelty, but carefully timed performances. Still, the question remained, who was writing them, and why? Theories multiplied. Some said it was an outsider, a traveler who took perverse pleasure in tormenting the village. Others were convinced it had to be one of their own, someone who knew the secrets too intimately to be a stranger. Each possibility was worse than the other. The pressure built until one night, a farmer caught sight of a shadow slipping near his gate, leaving an envelope behind. He gave chase, but the figure vanished into the fields. The only detail he could recall was that the person seemed small, slight, perhaps a woman, perhaps a youth. The description narrowed nothing, and in truth, it only deepened the paranoia. By now, the letters had become more than a crime. They were a test of the village itself. Every new accusation widened the cracks, every unanswered question deepened the silence. And through it all, the poison pen remained unseen, as though the very spirit of the village had turned against itself. By the time the letters had plagued Little Ashford for nearly 2 years, the village was transformed. Friendships were broken, marriages strained, livelihoods ruined. The letters had become less a mystery than a way of life, a constant dread that one's name might appear in the next envelope. One's secrets, true or false, paraded in blocky, merciless script. The police, pressured by county officials and desperate villagers, intensified their search. Inspector Briggs returned with handwriting experts from London, who compared the jagged script to samples collected from nearly every villager. The analysis was inconclusive. Some claimed a strong resemblance to Mrs. Edith Lawson's writing. Others pointed out similarities with 2 other women in the village. The experts, frustrated, admitted what Briggs had long suspected. The poison pen deliberately disguised their hand. Still, suspicion fell hardest on Edith. She was outspoken, known for her sharp tongue, and many believed she possessed both the knowledge and the malice to write the letters. The police searched her home, finding paper and ink similar to that used in the letters. But in a village, such evidence was hardly unique. Nearly every household owned the same supplies. When Edith was formally charged, the village seemed ready to breathe a sigh of relief. Here was a culprit, someone to blame, someone to punish. Her trial drew crowds from across the county, journalists eager to report on the village scandal. Witnesses described her gossiping habits, her knowledge of others' affairs, her frequent disputes with neighbors. The prosecution painted her as a bitter woman lashing out at those around her. But the case was shaky. No one had caught her in the act. The letters had continued even while she was under questioning. And when the defense pointed this out, doubt crept back in. Could she truly have maintained the campaign so relentlessly while under constant scrutiny? Or had the village, desperate for resolution, convinced itself of her guilt? The jury acquitted her. Edith left the courtroom pale but defiant, insisting she had been framed by neighbors eager to silence her outspoken ways. Some villagers believed her. Others whispered that the acquittal was a miscarriage of justice. The poison pen, they said, had slipped free once again. For a time, the letters ceased. Then, months later, a handful reappeared, fewer than before, but written in the same jagged hand. Their reemergence was enough to keep suspicion alive. Edith, though legally cleared, never escaped the shadow of doubt. She lived the rest of her life isolated, shunned by many who still believed her guilty. The true author of the poison pen letters was never definitively identified. Some criminologists later suggested that multiple writers may have been involved, using the chaos as cover to air their own grievances. Others believed Edith had indeed been the culprit, growing too cautious to continue after her trial. Still others argued the letters had been the work of an outsider, someone who passed through and left the village to tear itself apart in the aftermath. What remained long after the letters stopped was the damage. families broken, reputations tarnished. A village once bound by shared routines left wary and divided. The poison pen had achieved what few criminals could: destruction without profit, chaos without gain, harm without tangible theft. For investigators, the case became a study in the power of words, how a simple envelope, arriving quietly in a mailbox, could carry the weight of a weapon. For the villagers, it was a lesson written in whispers, that trust, once poisoned, is slow to recover, and sometimes never does. And the question that lingered, long after the last letter was sent, was the same that haunted the village from the beginning. Was the poison pen ever truly silenced? Or did they simply stop writing, content to watch a village live forever in the shadow of their words? Story 6. The farmer who kept finding money in his hay bales. It began, as many strange stories do, with something so out of place it seemed like a dream. John Cartwright was not a man given to fancies. A farmer in the rolling hills of Lincolnshire, he lived a life of rhythm and routine. Dawn meant milking the cows. Noon meant repairing fences. Evening meant counting the eggs collected from the hens. His farm was not wealthy, but it was steady, and steadiness was the one thing John valued most. That is why, on a cool September morning, when his baler spit out a bundle of hay with something crisp and papery tucked inside, John stopped short. At first, he thought it was just a bit of old newspaper tangled in the grass. But when he pulled it free, his fingers met not ink-smeared newsprint but the distinct texture of banknotes. 5-pound notes, folded neatly, pressed flat by the weight of hay. John stared at them for a long while, unsure whether to laugh or look over his shoulder. Money did not simply appear on a farm. Money had to be earned, scraped together, guarded. Yet here it was, fluttering between blades of dry grass like a secret. He pocketed the notes, more puzzled than pleased, and went back to his work. He told himself it was likely some careless traveler had lost the money in the fields. But the following week, when another bale rolled out with more notes tucked deep inside, the explanation seemed far less simple. Soon the discoveries became regular. Every few days, as John stacked his hay bales, he would find small bundles of cash hidden among them. Sometimes a handful of fivers, other times larger denominations, 10s, 20s, even a 50 once, pressed so tightly into the hay that it took minutes to tease it free. The first instinct was suspicion. John turned the notes over in his hands, half expecting them to be counterfeit. But they were genuine, crisp, authentic, and utterly out of place in the straw. For weeks, John said nothing. He slipped the money into an old biscuit tin and kept working his land. He was not a greedy man, and yet there was a strange unease in holding onto the notes. They felt more like a message than a gift, though he could not decipher what it meant. Word spread slowly, as it always does in small towns. A neighbor helping with the harvest noticed John's careful handling of a bale, the way he tucked something quickly into his pocket. A cousin saw him withdraw notes from the biscuit tin to pay for supplies in town. Soon, whispers began. John, they said, had stumbled onto a secret fortune. The police were eventually called, not because John had stolen anything, but because no one could make sense of where the money was coming from. Officers arrived at the farm, collected samples of the hay, and inspected the machinery. Nothing obvious explained how the cash was winding its way into the bales. Speculation bloomed. Some said it was the spoils of a robbery, hidden in fields long ago and forgotten until John's baler churned it up. Others claimed it was part of a smuggling operation. The hay used to transport contraband, the money misplaced in the process. More fanciful villagers suggested the notes were cursed, planted as part of some strange ritual meant to lure John into misfortune. John himself remained quiet, watching the pile in his biscuit tin grow. He wanted no trouble, but trouble seemed to find him. Bank representatives arrived, carefully inspecting the serial numbers on the notes. Detectives traced the currency back through records, some of it linked to local banks, some untraceable altogether. The strangest part was consistency. Week after week, month after month, new bales revealed new caches. It was never a fortune all at once, just a steady drip of money, as though someone, somewhere, wanted John to keep finding it. For a man who had never trusted good fortune, the effect was disorienting. At night, John sat at his kitchen table, the biscuit tin open, the notes stacked in careful bundles. He wondered if he should burn them, hand them all over, or simply pretend they had never appeared. Yet curiosity, stronger than caution, kept him collecting bale after bale. And always the question hovered: who was putting the money there? And what debt, invisible for now, would he one day be asked to repay? The longer the money appeared, the harder it became to treat it as chance. A stray note here or there could be explained away as carelessness. But John Cartwright was now pulling banknotes from hay bales with unsettling regularity, enough to raise eyebrows far beyond his small Lincolnshire village. The local constable, at first bemused, grew alarmed. He filed a report, which traveled up the chain until Scotland Yard became interested. A man finding hidden cash in bales of hay was not, on the surface, a pressing matter. But when it became clear that some of the notes traced back to bank robberies committed years earlier, the case took on a new significance. The police theories. The police offered explanations, none entirely convincing. The first theory was the simplest. The money had been hidden deliberately, stored in the hay for safekeeping by criminals who never returned to collect it. Perhaps the bales had been moved, sold, or passed along over the years until they landed on John's farm, where his machinery dislodged their secret. But this theory faltered when the pattern continued. The cash was not old, dusty, or decayed, as one would expect from bundles hidden years earlier. Many of the notes were recent issues. Someone, it seemed, was still planting them. The second theory was darker. Investigators suggested John himself might be fabricating the story, inserting the money into bales to cover for some illicit source of income. Smuggling, money laundering. They examined his accounts, his routines, even his extended family. But John was, by every measure, an ordinary farmer. His records were dull, his habits predictable, his connections unremarkable. The third theory struck closer to the village's imagination: that John was caught in the middle of a smuggling route. Lincolnshire's broad fields and proximity to old coastal trading lines had long made it a quiet corridor for contraband. Was it possible, detectives asked, that hay was being used as camouflage for criminal dealings? Was John's land a drop point, his discovery an accident he was never meant to make? Pressure on John. Whatever the explanation, John found himself under growing pressure. Bank officials wanted the money turned over in full. The police wanted him to keep reporting every discovery. Neighbors, once sympathetic, now eyed him with suspicion. "Why you, John?" they asked. "Why not the rest of us baling hay?" The attention gnawed at him. Every time he walked into the village shop, conversation stopped. Some whispered that he had made a bargain with someone unsavory. Others muttered that he was cursed. The farmer, who had always preferred the solitude of his fields, now felt like a man exposed on a stage he never chose to stand on. At night, he stopped sleeping well. The biscuit tin of money still sat on the kitchen table, but now he stared at it with dread instead of curiosity. The notes no longer looked like small miracles but like bait, and he could not shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching to see what he would do with them. A breakthrough. The first real lead came almost by accident. A police inspector traced several notes to a robbery that had occurred only a year earlier in a nearby town. A post office had been hit by two masked men who escaped with thousands of pounds. Most of the stolen cash was never recovered, and among the serial numbers recorded in the aftermath were matches to the notes John had pulled from his hay. This discovery shifted the tone of the investigation. What had once been treated as a curiosity now became evidence of a serious crime. Detectives descended on the farm, combing through John's machinery, inspecting his fields, and even interviewing his farmhands. They searched the barn, the sheds, the farmhouse. They left with more questions than answers. The working theory now was that John's land had been used to hide stolen loot. But again, the regularity of the finds did not fit. Robbers hid their spoils once, not repeatedly, week after week. Unless, of course, someone was deliberately feeding the money into the bales, an accomplice, a rival, or perhaps a desperate villager trying to quietly dispose of dangerous evidence. The community fractures. Meanwhile, the village itself was unraveling under the weight of the mystery. People began accusing one another in whispers. Who had the motive to hide money this way? Who had the knowledge of John's farm schedule? One name, then another, circulated at the pub, around the parish, at market stalls. Some claimed it must be a farmhand slipping notes into the hay during baling. Others thought it was an outsider taking advantage of John's routine. John felt the suspicion acutely. His neighbors' once friendly greetings grew curt. Children teased his own grandchildren, calling them hay bank bobbies. Shopkeepers hesitated before taking his money, as though afraid it carried some curse. And still the notes kept coming. A turning point. One afternoon, when John split open a bale and discovered not the usual handful of notes but nearly 500 pounds in a tight, deliberate bundle, he realized this was no longer a curiosity but a message. The placement was too careful, the stack too clean. Someone wanted him to notice. He handed the bundle to the police immediately, his hands trembling. "This isn't just chance," he told them. "Someone's using me for something." The inspector nodded gravely. "We think you're right, Mr. Cartwright. The question is, what's the end game?" The mystery had stretched on for months, long enough that John Cartwright stopped expecting answers. Yet the police, pressed by both the media and the banks eager to recover their losses, persisted. They followed leads across counties, scrutinized serial numbers, and mapped every discovery on John's farm. Slowly, a picture began to form, not neat, but suggestive. Following the money. The turning point came when analysts noticed a pattern in the serial numbers. The bundles John found were not random assortments. Many were sequential, drawn from the same batches issued by local banks. That meant whoever was planting the notes had direct access to stolen or laundered currency, not just loose bills. Detectives cross-referenced the sequences with unsolved robberies. Several matched, most notably the post office heist the year before. But what baffled them was the method. Why scatter the proceeds in hay bales, ensuring eventual discovery, instead of hiding them somewhere secure? The answer came from an unexpected angle. A forensic accountant suggested that the money was being bled into circulation, intentionally hidden where it could later be found by someone with a clean record. A farmer like John, with no criminal history, could unknowingly launder dirty cash just by spending it. If he used the notes for supplies, repairs, or wages, the money re-entered the economy without suspicion. The theory fit too well. John wasn't the target of generosity or chance. He was being used. Watching the farm. Undercover officers were placed near the farm, watching for anyone approaching the fields. For weeks, they saw nothing unusual. But in November, as dawn broke over the frost-covered grass, they spotted a figure slipping along the hedgerows. He carried a small satchel and moved with the nervous pace of someone avoiding notice. When intercepted, the man turned out to be a seasonal farmhand who had worked for John briefly the year before. In his satchel were several bundles of notes, wrapped tightly with elastic bands. Under questioning, he admitted to being paid to distribute the money into hay bales, though he insisted he never knew the source. He had been told simply to feed the fields and let the farmer do the rest. The handoff, it turned out, came from a network of small-time criminals linked to larger laundering operations. By scattering the money through everyday people, farmers, delivery workers, even charity bins, they diluted suspicion. John's farm was just one node in a larger web. The resolution. The discovery ended John's ordeal, though not neatly. The police collected the remaining notes, and banks reclaimed what they could. Several arrests followed in nearby towns, including a pair of men tied to the post office robbery. The seasonal worker, though cooperative, received a suspended sentence for his role. John himself was cleared of wrongdoing, though the shadow of suspicion lingered longer than he liked. Neighbors, slow to let go of gossip, continued to mutter that he had known more than he admitted. For a man who prized his good name above all else, the damage felt permanent. The biscuit tin, once fat with strange bounty, now sat empty on his kitchen table. John put it away in the cupboard, unwilling to throw it out, but never again filling it with notes. His fields returned to the quiet rhythms of farming, the only harvests now the ones he planted with his own hands. Reflections on the case. The case of the hayfield money was remembered in Lincolnshire for years as one of those odd, almost folkloric crimes strange enough to stir imaginations, mundane enough to vanish from national headlines. Yet for criminologists, it highlighted a truth often overlooked. Laundering networks thrive not only in cities and boardrooms, but also in the overlooked corners of rural life. Ordinary people, unsuspecting or unwilling, can be folded into schemes much larger than themselves. John had become, however briefly, a pawn in a game he neither understood nor asked to play. His fields were not just fields, they were conduits for stolen wealth, a hiding place masked as innocence. And in the quiet that followed, John sometimes wondered late at night. If the police had not intervened, how long would it have gone on? How much money would have trickled through his bales, turning his honest farm into a silent machine for crime? The thought was unsettling that in tending his land, in stacking his hay, he had unknowingly carried the weight of other men's sins. And it raised a question that lingered long after the last note was found. How many other ordinary places in other quiet towns were being used the same way, their owners unaware, their fields hiding secrets beneath the straw? Story 7. The town treasurer who disappeared with the ledgers. In the late 1970s, the market town of Malton in North Yorkshire seemed an unlikely stage for scandal. With its cobbled high street, Saturday markets, and slow pace of life, it projected an image of rural stability. Yet beneath that calm, the finances of the town council were in the hands of a man who would one day vanish, taking not only money, but also the very records that could explain what happened. A trusted figure. The man was Arthur Belling, the long-serving town treasurer. To the townsfolk, Arthur was as solid as the sandstone walls of Malton's church. He had been treasurer for more than 20 years, known for his neat handwriting in the council books and his calm presence during meetings. His salary was modest, but his respectability was not. Arthur's office, tucked in the back of the council hall, was a place few ever visited. He alone handled the ledgers, the accounts, and the disbursements. In a time before computerized records, the financial life of the town existed almost entirely in his careful pen strokes. No one doubted him, no one checked his math. It was this trust that made what followed so devastating. The day he was gone. On a gray morning in October 1979, Arthur did not arrive at the council hall. His absence was unusual but not alarming. By the second day, colleagues tried his home. The curtains were drawn, the house locked. Inside, no one answered. By the third day, worry grew. Police were called. When officers forced entry, they found the house empty, not just of Arthur but of personal belongings. Clothes, photographs, and even books were missing. There was no sign of struggle, no forced exit. He had left deliberately. But the real shock came at the council hall. When clerks opened the strong room where the ledgers were kept, they found shelf after shelf bare. Every book, every page, every record Arthur had maintained was gone. The missing money. Without the ledgers, the council was blind. How much money was supposed to be in the accounts? How much had been spent? How much was missing? No one could say. Local banks reported irregular withdrawals over the preceding months, but without documentation, the scale of the problem was unclear. Speculation ran wild. Some claimed Arthur had fled with thousands of pounds enough to start a new life abroad. Others insisted he must have been coerced, the ledgers stolen by criminals who needed to erase debts. A few even whispered that the man had not fled but met with foul play, his disappearance staged to cover a darker crime. A community in crisis. For Malton, the effect was immediate. Bills went unpaid. Contractors who had repaired roads or built council housing demanded money that no one could confirm was owed. Salaries for clerks were delayed. The local newspaper ran headline after headline. Treasurer VANISHES town accounts gone. Ordinary residents felt the strain. Taxes were raised abruptly to cover shortfalls, sparking anger. Meetings of the town council turned hostile, with residents shouting from the gallery, "Where's our money?" The disappearance was more than a financial scandal. It was a wound to the town's trust in its own governance. Arthur, the man everyone thought they knew, had left them adrift in uncertainty. The search. Police issued alerts across Britain, circulating Arthur's photograph to ports and airports. Rumors claimed he had been spotted in London, in Liverpool, even as far away as Spain. None were confirmed. Scotland Yard assisted briefly but soon withdrew. Without clear evidence of a crime, the case slid into the limbo of wanted for questioning. Back in Malton, suspicion turned inward. Had Arthur acted alone, or had someone helped him? Why had no one noticed irregularities sooner? Counselors who once praised his diligence now disowned him, insisting they too had been fooled. For months the town waited for resolution, but Arthur never returned. And so the central question remained. Was he a cunning thief who planned his escape for years, or a man caught in something far more complex, forced to vanish to save himself? The first weeks after Arthur Belling's disappearance were consumed by confusion, but as winter set in, the search gained structure. Detectives pieced together fragments of Arthur's life, hoping to trace his path. Yet the man who had seemed so ordinary revealed hidden layers, each one complicating the story. The accountant's double life. On the surface, Arthur had lived simply. He rented a modest terraced house, attended church on Sundays, and kept to himself. He never married, never drank heavily, never traveled far from Malton. But as police dug deeper, contradictions emerged. Neighbors recalled late-night visitors to his house, strangers, often arriving in cars with out-of-town plates. A bank clerk remembered Arthur withdrawing sums far above his official salary. A shopkeeper noted that he always carried crisp banknotes, folded neatly in his pocket, as if freshly withdrawn from large bundles. None of this had raised alarm before. Now, in the harsh light of suspicion, it painted the picture of a man living quietly but dealing in shadows. Financial footprints. Investigators followed the money. Records at Lloyd's Bank revealed that Arthur had opened not just one, but 5 accounts in different branches, moving money between them in a pattern difficult to follow. Some transfers led to accounts in London. Others disappeared into building societies under false names. Tracing these transactions was slow in the pre-digital era, but one thread stood out. Several deposits matched dates of large withdrawals from the council's treasury. Police could not prove it without the missing ledgers, but the implication was clear. Arthur had been siphoning funds systematically, perhaps for years. The total, once pieced together, was staggering. Estimates ran as high as £200,000, a fortune in 1979, enough to buy multiple houses outright. The leads abroad. By early 1980, reports of sightings trickled in. A man resembling Arthur was seen boarding a ferry to Calais. Another, speaking in a Yorkshire accent, was overheard in a bar in Alicante, Spain, boasting of starting fresh. Interpol was notified, but without firm evidence, little could be done. Spain in particular was a haven for British fugitives. Extradition treaties were patchy, enforcement weaker still. It was entirely plausible that Arthur had slipped into the expat communities along the Costa del Sol, living under a false name, enjoying the very funds he had stolen. Rumors of an accomplice. Yet not everyone believed Arthur had acted alone. Some detectives wondered how a man of his background could orchestrate such an elaborate disappearance. Who taught him the mechanics of laundering money through multiple accounts? Who arranged the safe passage abroad? One theory centered on his late-night visitors. Several were traced to small-time businessmen in York, men with reputations for shady dealings. It was suggested that Arthur had become entangled with criminal associates who used him as a front, and when the pressure grew, he was either helped to vanish or forced into hiding. Others in Malton whispered darker ideas. Perhaps Arthur never left willingly. Maybe those men had silenced him, taking the ledgers not to cover his thefts, but to bury evidence of their own. The town's growing despair. Meanwhile, the town of Malton continued to suffer. Without clear accounts, the council could not plan budgets. Road repairs stalled. Promised housing projects collapsed. Taxes remained high, fueling resentment. Arthur's name became a curse. Shopkeepers muttered it when paying higher rates. Farmers spat it over pints in the pub. To many, he was not just a thief but a traitor, a man who had crippled the very community that had trusted him. The police, for all their efforts, seemed powerless. Each lead fizzled into rumor. Each supposed sighting dissolved into uncertainty. The trail grew colder by the month. A lingering mystery. By the summer of 1980, nearly a year after the disappearance, the investigation was officially scaled back. Arthur remained wanted, his face posted on faded notices, but active pursuit dwindled. The case might have ended there, another fugitive lost to history, had it not been for a curious development 2 years later, when an old suitcase turned up in a second-hand shop in Leeds. Inside were documents, letters, and fragments of financial notes written in Arthur's distinctive hand. They hinted at something stranger still, not just theft, but a hidden motive tied to debts, threats, and a fear Arthur described only as the pressure. What exactly had he been running from? The discovery of the battered suitcase in a Leeds second-hand shop in 1982 revived a case most had assumed was dead. Its cracked leather smelled of damp, its lock broken. Inside, amid yellowing shirts and worn shoes, were papers written in the looping, precise hand of Arthur Belling, the vanished treasurer of Malton. The suitcase papers. The letters were fragmentary, many water-damaged, but enough remained to sketch a troubling picture. Arthur wrote of debts that cannot be spoken of men who visited at night to remind me of obligations, and of the fear that they will come for me if I cannot deliver. He referred repeatedly to the ledgers not as records of his thefts, but as leverage. "Without them, I am nothing," one page read. Another said, "If they take the books, they take my protection." This cast the missing ledgers in a new light. Perhaps Arthur had not removed them merely to cover embezzlement. Perhaps he held them as bargaining chips in a dangerous relationship with criminal associates. A man in over his head. Piecing it together, investigators theorized that Arthur had begun by skimming modest sums from the council accounts, confident no one would notice. But at some point, others discovered his secret. Instead of exposing him, they exploited him, demanding he funnel more money, threatening consequences if he refused. By the time he vanished, Arthur may have been less a mastermind than a desperate pawn, cornered by forces he could not control. The suitcase suggested he feared for his life as much as he sought freedom. Traces abroad. The suitcase also contained tickets, old ferry stubs to Calais, a receipt from a boarding house in Ostend, and a map of the French Riviera marked with circles. Police renewed contact with Interpol, searching for traces of Arthur in Belgium, France, and Spain. They uncovered tantalizing hints. A British man using the name Alan Bell had rented a flat near Nice in 1980, paying in cash, disappearing 6 months later. A bank in Geneva reported a dormant account opened under similar details, but none of it could be firmly tied to Arthur. Even with these leads, the trail remained smoke glimpses of a man always one step beyond reach. Malton moves on. Back in Malton, the years dulled the immediate anger but not the consequences. The financial losses were never fully recovered. Projects abandoned in 1979 left scars. A half-built estate on the edge of town stood derelict for decades, a monument to vanished money. The council introduced stricter checks, ending the era of blind trust in a single treasurer. Dual signatures, independent audits, and annual reviews became standard. In that sense, Arthur's betrayal reshaped local governance permanently. For the townsfolk, however, the wound lingered. Older residents still spoke his name with bitterness. Younger ones heard it as a cautionary tale, a story of misplaced trust, whispered alongside other local legends. Unanswered questions. Did Arthur live out his days sipping wine on a Mediterranean terrace, untroubled by the chaos he left behind? Or did the very men he feared eventually find him, silencing him far from Yorkshire? No body was ever recovered. No trial was ever held. His face remained frozen in the black and white photograph that once stared from wanted posters, a reminder of a man who slipped through the cracks of both community and law. Reflection. Arthur Belling's story is not one of dramatic violence or infamous infamy. It is quieter, yet in its way more unsettling. A trusted official vanished with the very records that proved his deeds, leaving a community paralyzed. His crime, if crime it was, blurred into coercion and fear. What remains is the silence of unanswered questions, the gaps in the ledger, the missing balance, the life lived in exile or ended in secrecy. Malton never got its closure, only a lingering reminder that even in the calmest of towns, betrayal can spring from the least expected places. And so the case remains unsolved, its conclusion written only in speculation. Did Arthur escape, or was he erased? Story 8. The Librarian Who Forged the Past. In the spring of 1991, the quiet market town of Hereford found itself at the center of a scandal that rippled through the academic world. At its heart was the city's cathedral library, a repository of medieval manuscripts, rare volumes, and centuries-old documents that scholars traveled from across Europe to study. The library had always prided itself on its openness. Students, researchers, and the simply curious could request access to its treasures with little more than a polite letter of introduction. Staffed by a handful of dedicated custodians, it seemed a sanctuary immune from the petty crimes of the outside world. Yet behind the oak doors and hushed corridors, something was amiss. For years, books had been vanishing. At first, it was scarcely noticed. A missing page here, a volume misplaced there. With thousands of works housed in the collection, it was easy to attribute the gaps to clerical error. But by 1991, the losses could no longer be dismissed as accidents. A quiet man with quiet access. Suspicion eventually settled on one man, John Gilbert, the cathedral's assistant librarian. To the outside eye, Gilbert was unremarkable. In his 50s, slightly stooped, he moved with the slow deliberation of a man who had spent his life among books rather than people. He lived alone in a modest house a short walk from the cathedral, attended evensong regularly, and was known for his encyclopedic knowledge of the library's holdings. No one had ever considered him dangerous. If anything, he was described as a little eccentric man who loved dusty tomes more than conversation. But that eccentricity proved to be cover for something far more troubling. The first alarming discovery. The scandal began with a visiting researcher from Germany, a medievalist who requested to see a rare 14th-century psalter. The book, last logged 5 years earlier, could not be found. Panic spread through the staff. A search of the stacks revealed not just one missing volume but several, all highly valuable. When records were compared, the disturbing truth emerged. The gaps matched periods when Gilbert had been responsible for cataloging and supervising access. Forgery and substitution. Worse still, investigators soon realized Gilbert had not merely stolen, he had forged. Some volumes he replaced with convincing replicas, blank books bound in period-style covers, with pages artificially stained and edges gilded to mimic age. To the casual eye, they seemed genuine. Only closer inspection revealed the deception. Scholars who had cited certain manuscripts in their research were horrified to learn they had unknowingly studied fakes. Decades of academic work were thrown into question. The scandal spread beyond Hereford, shaking the world of rare books and archives. Motive murkier than money. At first, the assumption was simple theft for profit. After all, the rare book market could command astronomical sums. But whispers suggested Gilbert's motives were stranger. Some believed he hoarded the books privately, driven by obsession rather than greed. Others claimed he sold only select items, keeping the rest hidden, constructing his own secret library. When police searched his home, they found not riches but chaos. Stacks of papers, crude forgeries in progress, and notes that suggested Gilbert considered himself a guardian of the manuscripts, as though by removing them from circulation, he alone could preserve their sanctity. A breach of trust. For Hereford, the revelations were devastating. The library had survived centuries of war, plague, and neglect, only to be plundered by one of its own custodians. The betrayal stung deeper because it was not committed by an outsider, but by a man entrusted with the keys. The case was far from closed. The extent of the thefts remained uncertain. Some believed hundreds of items had been taken over the years. The full scale of Gilbert's scheme and the fate of the missing manuscripts would only be uncovered in the months to come. But for now, the central question lingered like a shadow over the cathedral. What drives a man who has spent his life guarding the past to steal it piece by piece? The disappearance of manuscripts from Hereford Cathedral did not stay a local scandal for long. Word spread quickly among the community of medieval scholars, manuscript dealers, and archivists across Europe. For them, the missing books were not only valuable artifacts, they were threads in the fragile fabric of recorded history. To lose them meant tearing holes in that fabric, gaps that could never be fully mended. Academics on the hunt. Among the first to take up the search were not police officers but academics. Researchers who had once consulted Hereford's collection began comparing notes. A French paleographer recalled that the manuscript he studied in 1987 bore unusual signs of restoration, pages inserted, ink suspiciously fresh. A Spanish scholar remembered being offered a Hereford manuscript at a book fair in Barcelona, though he had dismissed it as a replica. These recollections suggested something more elaborate than isolated thefts. Gilbert had not simply pocketed books and sold them piecemeal. He had engaged in an ongoing process of substitution, disguise, and distribution, a one-man black market dressed in the robes of a humble librarian. Dealers and the gray market. Investigators soon realized that the world of rare book dealing was murky. Though legitimate dealers maintained strict records, a shadowy parallel market thrived, especially in the 1980s and early 1990s. Collectors were often willing to overlook provenance if it meant acquiring something unique. Manuscripts could pass quietly from seller to buyer, washed of their origin by layers of silence. Tracing Gilbert's trail meant unraveling these transactions. Some dealers cooperated, others insisted on ignorance. But bit by bit, a pattern emerged. Manuscripts last seen in Hereford surfaced in Paris, Milan, and even New York, often under slightly altered descriptions. A psalter listed as Private English Collection, 20th Century, or a missal said to be from an old estate. The forensic tools of scholarship. To prove these were indeed stolen items required unusual detective work. Instead of fingerprints and DNA, the investigators relied on marginalia, ink analysis, and parchment studies. Scholars compared catalog entries from the 19th century with modern finds, noting idiosyncrasies. A smudge on folio 43, a binding flaw noted by an archivist in 1902. These tiny details became their evidence. One striking example came from a book of hours, found in Amsterdam. Experts proved it was the same volume once in Hereford by identifying a wormhole that aligned perfectly through several pages, a natural signature, impossible to fake. Gilbert under pressure. Meanwhile, Gilbert himself faced mounting scrutiny. Initially suspended from his position, he grew increasingly reclusive. Neighbors recalled curtains drawn at odd hours, the glow of a lamp in his study long into the night. When police finally raided his house a second time, they found fragments of manuscripts cut apart, suggesting he had been dismantling some books to make their sale easier. The image of the gentle librarian collapsed. He was revealed instead as a manipulator of history, carving apart sacred texts as though they were puzzles to be rearranged for profit. A question of motive. Yet the mystery deepened. Financial records showed Gilbert was not wealthy. He had not bought property, nor lived lavishly. Much of the money from sales seemed to vanish as quickly as it came. Some speculated he used it to acquire other rare books, stolen wealth converted into different forms of treasure. Others believed he was motivated less by gain than by obsession, feeding a compulsion to control and possess manuscripts, even if it meant mutilating them. To scholars, this was perhaps the greater crime, not the theft itself, but the destruction of historical integrity, the breaking apart of volumes that had survived centuries intact. A trail across borders. By late 1992, authorities in Britain, France, and the Netherlands had joined forces. Warrants were issued, shipments intercepted. Slowly, books began returning to Hereford, sometimes anonymously left in packages at libraries, or delivered through intermediaries unwilling to admit their role in the trade. Still, many remained missing, and questions loomed. How many had Gilbert sold? How many had he hidden? Were their caches still waiting in some dusty attic, or had the most valuable works already disappeared into private collections, never to resurface? The chase was far from over. Each recovered volume brought relief, but also frustration, a reminder of the countless others still lost. And always, the same unresolved thought persisted. Had Gilbert acted alone, or was there a network behind him, profiting quietly from the treasures he smuggled out of the cathedral? By the winter of 1993, the walls were closing in around John Gilbert. The man who had once walked the aisles of Hereford Cathedral Library as a trusted custodian now found himself cast as a thief, a forger, and a betrayer of history. The investigation that began with missing psalters and forged bindings had widened into a full criminal case, with international ramifications. The arrest. Gilbert was finally arrested after investigators traced a particularly valuable manuscript, a 12th century missal, to a German dealer who admitted under pressure that it had come directly from him. The paper trail was damning. Police swooped in on Gilbert's modest terraced home. Behind the neat exterior, they found chaos: boxes of parchment scraps, bindings ripped from books, and half-completed forgeries. In the cellar, they uncovered what some later described as a crypt of broken history. Pages torn from manuscripts stacked in bundles, covers separated from texts, and fragments too damaged to ever be restored. It was as though Gilbert had set out to dismantle the past piece by piece, only to drown in his own compulsion. The trial. When the case went to court, it drew enormous attention from the academic community. Witnesses included scholars who testified about the missing volumes, dealers who admitted to buying manuscripts of questionable provenance, and conservationists who spoke of the near irreparable harm done. The charges were extensive: theft, fraud, forgery, and destruction of cultural property. Prosecutors emphasized not just the monetary value, though millions of pounds were at stake, but the cultural devastation. One likened it to tearing chapters out of the history of Europe. Gilbert's defense painted a different picture. A man overcome by obsession, who never intended to profit but merely to protect manuscripts from mishandling. His barrister suggested he was more curator than criminal, albeit a deeply misguided one. The jury, however, was unmoved. Sentence and scandal. In 1995, Gilbert was sentenced to several years in prison. The punishment was as much symbolic as practical, a declaration that the theft of history itself was a crime against society. But the sentence did not undo the damage. Many manuscripts were still missing. Some had been mutilated beyond recognition, their value destroyed. Others had vanished into private collections, where they might never be seen again. The trial left Hereford Cathedral Library scarred. Trust had been shattered. New security measures were imposed: tighter access, detailed cataloging, and surveillance that would have seemed unthinkable in the open, scholarly atmosphere of earlier decades. The aftermath. The reverberations spread far beyond Hereford. Across Europe, libraries and archives reevaluated their practices. Institutions that had long relied on honor systems began to tighten controls. The scandal prompted conferences on the protection of cultural heritage, spurred international agreements on provenance, and fueled debates about whether rare works should remain accessible to the public or be locked away. Scholars, too, bore the consequences. Research based on forged or missing manuscripts had to be revisited, citations questioned, arguments rewritten. The credibility of entire studies was undermined by Gilbert's deception. The human question. Yet for all the cataloging, the trials, and the reforms, the deeper question remained unresolved. Why did Gilbert do it? Was it greed, a desire for wealth hidden behind his quiet lifestyle? Was it obsession, the compulsion of a man who believed he could only love manuscripts by possessing them? Or was it something stranger still, a warped sense of stewardship in which he convinced himself that by hiding the books away, he alone was protecting them from careless hands? Those who studied the case came to no consensus. To some, he was a thief like any other, exploiting his access for personal gain. To others, he was a tragic figure undone by his own fixation, a man whose love of books metastasized into destruction.